Hello everyone, today we talk about Diocletian's domestic policy. I already made, of course, multiple videos on Diocletian, some were very old, and it's important to focus specifically on the epoch-making tax reform that fundamentally would be inherited by the empire, but also spreading, of course, ecumenically beyond that. Right, the tax system set by Diocletian essentially left an ineliminable footprint, and of course, as such, a dramatically important one, not just in Roman history, in the Byzantine Empire, if you want, defining, in fact, part of what makes us approximately calling it that, aside from Roman Empire, but also because of its implications for foreign peoples. This is particularly relevant. I'm not going to digress too much on it, but I promise if you're interested to do something a bit more dedicated, right? The Sasanian Empire did apply part of Diocletian's essentially administrative, we're talking about the tax system, but as such, as we will see now, broader societal reform. Right, in this case, mostly because of in their own economy, especially the one of Mesopotamia. But this is valid also for the more humble and sort of down-to-earth, literally also by size, the communities, Slavic economy of the Mir, right? All the populations that later on would penetrate in large quantity in the empire. Surely already at this time, as Proto-Slavs, at least in ways that could not make us track them more precisely, were already settling some parts of the Balkans and entering, in fact, a world that doesn't matter how sort of, at this point, already eroded, right, compared to the possibility of properly of a statalization. We will see it now because Diocletian's formula somehow failed to a margin, but again, the footprint that it left, even in the local village, rural life, as we will understand now, would affect the populations entering the empire, right? There aren't so many ways you can rule these polities, so in many ways historiography discussed at length, and it keeps doing it naturally, the actual responsible, say, who really did create this system? Was it Diocletian, as opposed to, I don't know, Constantine and military reform, right, that we attribute again to this or that ruler? But as a matter of fact, we're just coming to be, and that the single emperor would have just either sort of accelerated that process or affirmed it, formalized, whatever. Right, so it's not exaggerated to say that in world history, Diocletian tax reform was of massive importance, from the Roman Empire to, in fact, the globe. Right, and surely this was coming at the end of a major period of crisis. As you know, even though Diocletian came already at a time which the empire had been saved, we'll have to talk more about Aurelian, the so-called Illyrian, even though it would be better to call them Messian emperors, and their great work of salvation and restoration as well. And so we don't have to forget that, I was discussing this recently in the video about the late Roman army, that in spite of the fact that, yes, the 4th century, the system founded at this generations, between the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th, between Diocletian and Constantine, was indeed a moment of major prosperity. I mean, it would have been hardly looking as a decadent system for the average Roman subject, in a sense. This had already been significantly debilitated by the previous centuries, and society, as we will see now also through the monastery reform, an attempt of salvation of the denarius, that is a bit like the leitmotif of Diocletian. Especially the lower classes had lost significantly a major, say, power purchase capacity, and there wasn't much eventually that could be saved. It's Constantine that fundamentally bets instead on the solidus and establishes a world, even here, major consequences to some historians, even starting the Middle Ages, even starting the feudal system or something, paving the way to that, right? What did Diocletian do? Well, we'll see it partly today, but we can make a synthesis of it. That is to say, he combined the annona and the capitation, let's say, instituting the famous formula capitatio-iugatio that we will see now. Essentially, capitatio is essentially the counting on the base of the head, like the capita censi, those who were just counted as individual subjects, while the iugatio has to do with essentially the unit of land, of the administrative district, right, corresponding to the estates where this amount of workers lived. We don't need to digress now on the colonist system, right? You know that in this process of weakening of the free peasantry during the 3rd century crisis, the Roman Empire had turned into an empire of citizens into one of subjects in many ways. This was already evident to some degree in Caracalla's times, at the time of the Constitutio Antoniniana. It had been the mechanism that we think of the Romans like sort of spreading their citizenship so freely, etc. No, it was a highly negotiable and actually quite exclusivistic dynamic that, as a process, as a becoming, made things work. But of course, when everybody had acquired, namely the same rights, this is exactly when those rights went sort of declining. The empire was a quite complex and different things within its parts, right? So there were, as we will see now, also from the iugatio at the time of Diocletian, like important differences from province to province. But these necessity, right, of essentially tying even just oneself to the land, because putting oneself under the protection, in fact, of a dominus and working as a theory on parchment, being on papyrus, being a freeman, but de facto becoming a serf, as a colonist working attached to that guy's household, and essentially having something to survive life, right? In the process of definitely proto-feudalization, in many ways, I already made videos about the passage from the Roman villa to the medieval curtis, so it's a well-known historiographical topic. Again, we don't touch on that, but we know what we're talking about. Diocletian thought that it was important to essentially consolidate this order and to connect the people to the land in an administrative districtuation that could provide the adequate amount of resources to the state, right, through the annona and through the fact that the bureaucratic system had to support the army and the oligarchy that ruled the system. And again, it's an incredibly complex topic historiographically, right? We could make a video only on the different interpretations different scholars gave this system, but we're not much interested in that, rather in defining something sort of more objective on the basis of my understanding of the thing, and of course of these thoughts as well, right? First of all, many points remain, obviously, and still, and will remain, obscure, right? We do not know fully, of course, how the late 3rd, early 4th century Roman administration worked concretely, but it is very clear as the fundamental fact that there was an equivalence between the caput and the iugum in such system. That is to say, for Diocletian, a unit of workers is equivalent to the ends of taxation to an imposable estate unit, right? And hence the term capitatio-iugatio. Starting from the statement, we have a key to understand, just even mnemonically, great part of the same in logic. Diocletian essentially split the empire in great regional units that were the diocesi, right? In English, regional sometimes takes the size of, I don't know, like the entirety of Gaul, right? Here, actually, it's something smaller, like you could even say provincial, but as we've seen here, we don't want to mess up the actual same Roman terminology. These dioceses were, in part, they would have a great importance for the development of the Christian ones that, as we will see now, were actually already existing, but of course the cult was still an underdog and even persecuted by Diocletian at the end of his reign. We will see it now. But eventually, right, this would help the rise of the same ecclesiastical hierarchy and administration, the same pattern. This diocese approximated to the so-called ethne, that is the nations in Greek, of which the bishop Hippolytus talked. We will see this, this part of the story, like regarding the various, political affiliations, certain religious policy, in fact, of the same Christendom. On another occasion, the Diocletian dioceses were the following: the Britannic one, two Gallic ones that were the ones of Vienne, and the so-called Gallican one. Then the Spanish one that included the Tingitana as well in North Africa, the Italian one, the African one, the Pannonian one, the Mesian, that would be Macedonian Dacian one, so-called, the Thracian, Asian, Pontic, and Oriental ones. Right, and for each of these, after all, large regional units, Diocletian basically had it calculated how much peasants it had, literally the hominum numerus in Latin, the number of men, and how much taxable land, that is the agrorum modus. And everything was pretty simple, right? It was a proportion between the two. You would relate the agrorum modus and the hominum numerus, and you would obtain in this fraction the unit of taxable land for which every caput, right, every worker, had to correspond for each diocese, right? In fact, each one of them had its own formula census. So the taxation formula, this quota for which a caput had to correspond to a certain amount of workable and taxable land that varied, in fact, across the different dioceses. So we will see now in what this diversity across the provinces consisted, right? And it's obvious, right? The diversity depended on the demographic density. Largely, right? This is not fully the case, of course, when there were large parts of the provinces that may have not been inhabited, cultivated, etc. But the idea is that whoever ruled over this region essentially controlled all the resources. So, albeit the various tax collectors, officials, etc., would consider practically the nuisances of every single community, land productivity, etc., the formulae census for each diocese were quite helpful because more or less, and there weren't radical differences, but still that they were meaningful, in fact, in this terms of demographic density, every caput, so in theory, for each inhabitant, right, it can work, the land is as extended, and so the higher the taxation pressure, let's say, the smaller the demographic density is. As you understand, this could generate some sort of problems when, of course, this density was lower for, in fact, less productivity in a way. But of course, also the way these taxes were collected at a higher level worked according to the functionality of the same region, after all. So everything was very capillary, but what matters rather is the big matters. After all, the Annona had been working more or less in similar ways. Now, there was a greater sort of definition of these quantities, so that the state would have a more precise idea of how much it could squeeze, right, in times of increased, say, need, right, of resources for defense purpose, for reform purpose, and so on, right? So the theoretical premise is that more or less consciously, you would culminate in the idea of the assimilation and the identification every single caput, that is labor force unit, to a cadastre area. In the Oriental diocese, a caput jugum, for example, was assimilated to 5 jugera of vineyards, 20 of plains, 40 of mountain terrain, 60 of land without quality, right, barren in a way, and so-called trite, by the way, in Greek, and so on, right? So there would be administratively, of course, substantial awareness, even in this degree of detail, of the terrain productivity. Comparing the Oriental diocese with the Gallican one, before, at least we have it for later times, because we don't know in Diocletian's times exactly what it was, but before Julian became a Caesar, so 355, a caput in the Gallican diocese had to provide taxation 25 solidi that would equate, here's a problem in the interpretation of the actual values of certain measures, more or less to 300 wheat modi, right? And we should understand, consider this, that for Cicero, a Lentinian uger, that is an exceptional one, however, would provide with 6 modi of seed, a product of 4860 modi, right? Which is definitely a lot, right? A great fertility, great productivity. That's where Cicero was in Sicily. Sicily, of course, was the single most fertile regions in Mediterranean. According to Columella, a uger, an average uger, gives with 5 modi of seed a product of 20 modi, right? So the 20 uger, which a Syrian caput, for example, of good quality could have provided, if we calculate an average of 30-40 modi per uger, that is a product of 600-800 modi, that is taking away 100 of seed, a sort of neat revenue of 700 modi, right? So barely double on average of this more or less 300 modi that the Gallican caput had to provide just with a single tribute, right? So if we consider this, the Gallican caput corresponded to a much more extended tax, district of the Syrian jugum, given that the Gallican demographic density was smaller than the Syrian one. Right? You understand how it worked. This system was, regulated according to the principle of collective responsibility, right? Which was extremely rigorously applied by this reform, because not only every single colonists caput was forced to pay the fixed quota of the registered in the formula census for the pertinent diocese. But every single curia, so the smaller, properly provincial, let's say, city level, was responsible for the number of the capita that were counted within the same. Right, so there was a massive hierarchical, say, precision in terms of who was not providing the required amount of mostly natural resources, right? And everything was regulated by officials who were deputed exactly to make this system work from the properly the bottom up, and it forced the local communities to responsibilize themselves, for which the colonists, as we've seen, there's this sort of inverted concept. If you want, you would think it's just about, say, more land for an individual would mean, well, I can't really work at all, can I? Instead, it was exactly this effort. It is to say, the colonists have to work forcibly the abandoned land, right? And this was, of course, aimed at increasing productivity, and so maintaining sort of trying to prevent what had occurred during the 3rd century crisis, that was essentially the shrinking of arable land, of worked land. Let's put it in better terms. That this is what happens in times of crisis. This happened also during the early Middle Ages. Later on, it happened after the Black Death, etc. Literally, the uncultivated areas took over again great parts of what had gone underpopulated and so on. This is the moment in which increasingly barbarians are, when captured, made prisoners, settled as peasants slash colonists in certain areas to become new labor force and manpower, etc. Because we will not see it today, but of course these colonists didn't just have to work. A certain quota of theirs had to be sent by their dominus as recruits for the army, so everything had to be regulated also as far as that, local hierarchy, authority, and discipline was concerned. Of course, there was a real, again, you understand the foundational concept of sort of medieval scenario taking place, where every community has to start being responsible, sort of self-sufficient in a way. It's almost a socialistic system, right? Let's not exaggerate. Of course, Diocletian did not have that in mind, but the idea of, let's say, irregimenting all the various communities in a way that, say, there wouldn't be any spontaneous movement and relaxation, etc., started at this point, right? And at least was enforced by the state to some important extent. There is the development in parallel of the Epibole institution. This is yet another Greek term that basically is split between the Epibole ono Sulon, that is to say, for that those lands cultivated by actual slaves, not by colonists, or at least not namely free peasants, and the Epibole ono Kenson, which was in fact for the lands cultivated by free colonists. And the same principle of collective responsibility regulated, as we said, the levy system known as functio temonaria, so the function for properly the levies, the recruits, for which, of course, a certain amount of contribuents, the capitulum, so those who actually pay the taxes and so produce wealth, is obliged to provide a recruit. This is basically the rota system in some way, or at least how it start being organized within the system. If you look at the Romano-Germanic recruitment law, basically the concept is the same. There are certain people that are counted within a village, basically, and only one of them will go to war, but the others have to provide them with a satisfactory amount of equipment, and everything is based on their wealth, right? The Romano-Germanic laws that are written, but also, say, the Germanic, Slavic words across, say, in the literate world throughout the early Middle Ages, etc., would work on the base of the same principle. That is also just what you're forced to do by nature, meaning, how do we function, how do we create our mini-state to be also independent in terms of security, right? Of course, it would be lords and oligarchies and controlling aristocratically and managing as well, but in by scale, like hierarchically, we would have all these various different levels of autonomization that in this case, the Roman Empire was just regulating, not just to give more autonomy, but actually to be sure to have greater control, but also a certain security that each community would provide exactly, right, without trying to sneak away from that, their given amount of labor force and manpower. Right, the same would go with, again, those laws in any other political territorial dominion, and this is why, I was saying before, for Europe, for the Mediterranean, this reform was such a big deal, because in part was surely corresponding again to certain social conditions that had already established themselves, but from the other, the state sort of facilitated further this problem to gain more power individually. Meaningful enough to this tributary criteria would be connected the preemption law, the connection of the colonists to the land, that is feudal serfdom, so much so that already in Roman times these peasants were essentially forced to, as the Latin expression went, literally inservire terris, right? So properly the concept, they had to work into properly that land, right? They were into that, and their service was connected to that very same place. Hence the capitatio-iugatio tributary connection, literally in Latin tributario nexu, ablative, like causal, as much as the colonist's title, that is, in fact, nomine et titulo colonorum, right? So it wasn't much the fact that they were just personally colonists, but they were properly connected to that specific plot according to the system. This is you understand by scale, like if you look at medieval Europe, that this is basically what came to be historically, even when, again, people were nominally free in many other contexts, de facto, right, they became spontaneously, or because of a state said so, and because of even imposition at some point, especially if they were slaves, they would be essentially placed in one area, and just like the agricultural system, pre-industrial one of the time, forced the wide majority, to say the least, of the people, they would have to work the land, right? And there was, if you want, even a sort of a harmony in that, because of course it doesn't sound particularly romantic, at least in comparison to our idea of the empire, where they were just citizens leaving the city, going to the therme, to the spectacles. But as always, any pre-industrial society had actually been fundamentally based on this, right? This is true in the empire, this is true in the Barbaricum. Just that there is essentially an aristocracy that lives off this people's work, and that fundamentally controls them, etc. And in this time of gradual, albeit at this point imperceptible, erosion. We will see now the monetary policy better compared to the first, the second century AD, right? How much a certain section of the population had lost purchasing power, was going as a trajectory, right? Of course, while we associate to Diocletian this system, right? He was not definitely nor the inventor, nor the last one to try to, of course, to further enforce, nor necessarily the one that thought necessarily how to implement it. Of course, there was a state, there were different ministers, officials, etc. At a local level, things tended to work, of course, with a degree of autonomy. Nothing was uniform, right? But tendentially, the fact that the same Roman society and law was, as we'll see now, was gradually orienting itself toward that direction, was just declaring what the world had come to and further consolidating on that basis, right? In any case, it's implicit in this reform, right? The same capitatio-iugatio mechanism that we described, and it's fair to historiographically associate it with Diocletian in the first place. So this Dalmatian emperor had thus truly left a ineliminable mark in European history. By this point, the equation of the land plot with the working unit that had to provide with that amount of labor force and manpower is definitely a Diocletian principle of statal and social control that also displays a sort of unitary, strongly unitary and rational, in this sense typically Diocletian mentality, which we'll try to understand better ideologically now. Because, of course, this seems like the major deal in a sort of structural sense, but of course this reflected a broader spirit and other reforms and probably a vision of the Roman Empire, right? The sense at this point was that Rome was surrounded by enemies, right? The 3rd century as such had instilled psychologically. I made recently a video about the conquests of the barbarians and the sins of the Romans, right? This awareness, that's also why the rise of Christendom, the sense that the empire to some extent had failed to deliver that promise, or at least there had been a peak of the golden era in Augustan times, and now, as you know, by prophecy, historically, also in the pagan world, the world was degenerating once again towards the abyss, the darkness, right? And this was proven also, and especially actually, by the same Roman civil wars, right? Rome, of course, was the divine empire. The Romans were the chosen people, and only evil, right, sin, with causing a fight within them, right, would allow the chaotic barbarian, right, to gain terrain, literally, like the aforementioned sort of capitatio-iugatio concept, which forced literally, you know, those areas that were less populated to work more in order to regain terrain. In fact, was also due to the fact that in part the empire was being not threatened but settled also by these elements that doesn't matter how much. Of course, the empire had not really Rome dominated the entire globe, entire universe, so it was not much of a spatial problem as such. But of course, these living beings, if entering at least the areas controlled directly by the empire, indirectly, but aside from the deterrence that existed outside, were still external elements. They were to be metabolized if you wanted, so there had to be further work for Romanizing them, etc. So all this reflected again a psychological need that in Diocletian's mind, as far as we can understand from these policies anyway, was centered on the idea that the older system, after all, as it had been founded by Augustus, had to resist, right? It didn't have to go on to undergo any specific change, right? It had to be maintained as much as possible, and so these reforms were essentially just implementing a renovation of order, right? I made a video about the end of the Tetrarchy, showing you in this sense what was Diocletian's thought behind also the necessity of splitting the empire, yes, but under different rulers, but in this sense not having too big chunks left on only a specific guy, and having this sort of machination for which the Caesars would become Augustan, then replicating the system in this way that had still to remain unitary, even though in a cyclical and split fashion. So this tax reform was aimed at reordering, especially the Roman working force, in order to make of the empire a great, in fact, field, right? A sort of, in fact, working area where the plebs rusticana, so the majority, like the rural population, the one, in fact, struck by the capitatio, that in line of principle, in fact, was not weighing on the city population. This is a very interesting aspect of the story we'll comment it now. Had to, however, work without rest, really, for the maintenance of the Roman civilitas, right? It's as if the citizens had a higher status, of course, and the army as well had to be maintained through the annona militaris, but there was also the annona civilis, right? So the plebs rusticana had to work more assiduously under a sort of military discipline themselves, and in order to maintain the system how it had been established, even under times of pressure. And it was, after all, a very logical idea, right? The idea that also those who lived in the cities fundamentally were just by itself, given that the city exists only because it can elevate itself, drawing the surplus from the country, so it's ipso facto just a community that is superior to the peasantry for which the latter works, right? So it's a concept that eventually, after the fall of the Roman Empire, would be split among the feudal elite in a more dispersed way, with the gradual, say, the decline, contraction of the urban life, etc., but practically the same. In this degree of aristocratic social stratification, the need of defining also very different societal roles, forcing the communities to functionalize themselves for the purpose of providing an order, right? How much did a medieval knight cost, right? It's not just the peasant workforce as majority, but you had to educate the priest to instill, like, Christian ideals for these guys to go fighting the crusades effectively and fanatically. So it was all, right, an enormous machinery that had to eventually self-perpetuate itself, which is a concept that really lives on, not just as a whole, as we've seen, especially in the so-called Byzantine world, where social certification would remain, in fact, much more rigid than in Latin Germanic Europe, but that also in the latter, as we were just saying, through feudalism, etc., would bring to an important degree of settlement. An instrumental way to maintain the previous order was Diocletian's attempt in re-establishing the trust in currency. This is also one of the other major historiographical debate, right, regarding, say, Diocletian's denarius versus Constantine's solidus, right? So silver at this point basically almost entirely copper, actually, as we will see now, versus gold, which, as you understand, is not really a winning strategy, and not even on the longer run here. Things, Diocletian tried, but went pretty downhill from there on, and just for social reasons, right? Not for abstract currency policies, but because just wealth was distributed in very uneven ways at this point. So the idea was that sort of a positive one, after all, that the average peasant soldier should have essentially been able to provide with enough product to sort of sustain eventually the same estate to which it belonged, and so in this sense avoiding to concentrate too much power in the hands of fewer privates, even though this colonist system was based entirely on it in a way. This was in a way just the ultimate sort of yoke you could put on the peasant, but at the same time that was objectively the only way to produce more, at least attempting to do so. These masses were exhausted by the civil wars, the barbarian invasions already to a certain extent, and they could have worked hard, and surely, especially if they were controlled by the aristocracy. But the aristocracy both in gold, and these other estates were, in this sense, not quite able to provide an equivalent of at least what the currency price was set by Diocletian, and had historically been, right? The denarius is a bit the currency of the bourgeoisie, if you want to put the thing. Instead, the solidus was the gold of the senatorial luxus, right? Diocletian tried, in this sense, to conciliate the irreconcilable. You have, from one side, providing with high value the divisional currency. So the denarius, that at this point, rather than a silver coin, is actually of whitened copper. On the other, founding a good monetary system, still with at least the cornerstone of the aureus, so the gold coin, that would be of 1/60th of a pound, and an argenteus, so a silver one, with 1/96th of the same. That is to say, the same of the Neronian denarius in the latter case. But as you understand, this is nonsense, right? It's considering how depleted, especially the denarius, had become at this point. Of course, this proportion doesn't make any sense. Here, the proportion is almost, say, not almost equal, but something. How much is it? 62, like 3 to 5, right? The vile divisional currency of the late 3rd century could have never, right, withstood the power, the comparison with good gold coins. But even good silver coins, if this had been, in fact, now as they had become so much different from the same, and the dynamic was pretty simple. The producers refused to sell to the soldiers, and in general, the bigger purchaser, with the poor prices expressed in denarii, right? Because the former would have, of course, gained much more with the price fixed by Diocletian in the famous Edictum de pretiis, right, of 301 AD, which was essentially the reaction to this timidity from the productive side. Those same, essentially, the same peasantry that was forced there to work, that should have not just broken its back in in the field, but should have at this point simply give their product almost for free, considering how low actually the denarius had fallen, and considering the prices that this Diocletian was trying to fix for the exchange. And as it was predictable, the Edictum was a failure. The failure of the divisional currency, and with that, of the common people of the Roman Empire. Right? They were just sinking. Diocletian wanted, of course, to represent a sort of stoically strong, resilient, sort of like Tony Soprano's, Gary Cooper's idea of the strong, silent type, right? That just does a thing. Here, it's just like today. There is a sort of collapse in everything. It's primarily a moral collapse. Right, the elites actually keep on working. This is essentially what Constantine understood by favoring the aureus, the gold currency, and establishing reinforcing de facto a true, not just an ideal, sort of dirigistic, statalistic order, but substantiating it with a true feudal dimension. Of course, the Constantinian system, and I made a video about especially the Constantinian Senate, was actually much more egalitarian than what at this time, for example, the Romano-Italic oligarchy, the senatorial class, and I made a video on that too, by the way, had become. Right, the West, in that sense, was already a bit more feudal already than the East was, because they are more sort of more evenly distributed. Well, overall, it existed. Telling the truth, Italy at this point was still the most sort of the per capita wealthiest area in the world. So even in per capita, in that sense, but still, given the fundamentally oligarchic nature of the same system, that speaks volumes of how already at this time things were so balanced after all. At least to try this monetary, this currency policy, how sort of more uneven, right, that would be during the Middle Ages. And of course, the Constantinian Senate was very oligarchic in nature, not as much as the Roman one in Italy, but nothing in comparison to what, say, the same Byzantine Empire would become during the High Middle Ages, by comparison, even just a couple of centuries later at this point. So everything should be, of course, measured in this relative terms, as far, for the sake of what we're discussing today, but just relating it to the very objectively and squared sort of differences in massively so in scale, right, throughout history, which is a completely different thing. So the Diocletian's desperate defense of the silver, or just copper whitened in silver denarius at this point. Let's compare a bit the decline with the previous centuries, right? These values, what was attempted to be preserved by the same Edictum de pretiis, was essentially mirroring what had been typically the relation with wheat prices, right? So on properly agricultural products, the ones that, as we've seen, the same country producers should have been up to, right? In 149 AD, with roughly 5 denarii, so we're talking about Trajans at this point, silver denarii, right, what had been established in Trajan times, still being worth that more or less at this time, that in the decades later, something like the 3.4 grams, just like the Nero's ones. That you know that Nero was essentially the actual the founder of this aureus denarius relation, right? So the reform, it lasted until Diocletian. Nero's monetary reform, basically the huge importance. We'll make a bit about that too. And of these 3.4 grams, 85% in the mid-2nd century was actual silver, right? And with that, this was what the price was based on. You could buy a modius of wheat, right? In Septimius Severus and Caracalla's times, you see that the denarius had only half of its theoretically total silver. So the cost of wheat had to double or even triple, right? And in Diocletian's times, when the denarius is a very vile coin, and it's at best 3.8 grams of whitened copper, but likely also much less as far as the one that actually circulated on average. The wheat price is 100 denarii a modius. This was known as the modius castrensis, right? So you understand that basically the price has increased 20 times compared to the mid-2nd century AD. So in Diocletian's thought, 3.8 grams of whitened copper, or much less, only because it was nominally a denarius, that is to say, the state coin, right, the one of, say, the common people, the poor people at this point. It had a 20 times smaller value than 3.4 silver grams, right, with only 85% of actual precious metal, like the one in the 2nd century. It could even be less, again, especially if we confront it with the modius italicus and we think that it was perhaps the castrensis one was the double of the former. We actually don't think that they were so different, but here there are all sort of different measurement problems that we know of certain units of measure, but we do not know exactly how they sort of corresponded. And even if just the information we have is reliable for the times, places, the comparisons, I mean, it's all pretty patchy and scattered information after all. But the concept is pretty clear, right? It's just absurd to pretend this sort of relation, consider that the same relation between silver and copper is in terms of value in natural economy. Let's say we could use this terrible term, but say just for the sake of brevity, something like 100 to 1, right? So just even what existed within the same white and copper measure between the two was ridiculous. Was essentially a 20 to 1, and also compared to how much value it had lost over time. This sense of silver being 100 times worthier than copper had sort of characterized the older Roman economy. It was improved in favor of copper, halving doubling its the value of the latter, only in the first 2 centuries of the empire, just because the economy was so prosperous you could make these tricks. The senatorial copper sesterces coin was backed by good imperial divisional silver, one the denarius at the time, and so when the denarius lost value, and it became de facto a copper coin, this natural tendency, right, towards the the normal relation between the value of silver and copper was sort of coming back to the origins, and so Diocletian was essentially forcing a system to something like the relation between the two 5 times less, right, in favor of copper. And this could not, like, who would have been so foolish? Everybody knew that, of course, that was a copper coin at that point, not a silver one anymore. So this is why the Edictum de pretiis, to make the long story short, failed, right? And how vain the defense of denarius really was. From Caracalla onwards, we will talk about this, really until with the 3rd century crisis down the road, the denarius had been constantly falling, because just the Roman middle class had fundamentally would have been consumed by all the wars, the destructions, and these are very fragile systems. I mean, the pre-industrial systems, these major devastations cause damage that cannot be fixed just from a day to another, and this was part of the reason why the system was, of course, shrinking, right? And that's when Constantine comes into play, realizing that in order to have a more governable system, and fundamentally a monarchic one, with the abolition of Tetrarchy, etc., it would have been much better to just base everything on the actual gold coin, just to accept that the commoners were gone largely, and they could be better controlled through a sounder elite and sort of more feudal system that, in fact, we associate so monetarily Constantine together with other measures with, right? So we can say that it's at this point really that broader system of the Principate failed, right? The Dominatus had kicked in, and at this point the older tradition of Augustus, monetarily also Nero's one, doesn't matter how much defended by Diocletian, that still wanted till the end to think the system to be able to be preserved, turned into unavoidably something else that was much more sustainable. And yes, with shortcomings, this was not like a positive thing, but again, systems do collapse, and so what do you do at that point if you do not have the moral and material resources to make up for that? You have to adapt on on a shrank basis, but still one that you can handle with greater ease. All right. Diocletian was a hell of a ruler, by the way. It was quite a positive one, as we will see now, and he was really that sort of based and strong-headed. The Roman state, according to him, was the thing for which the Illyrian emperors had been fighting to preserve. There was a divine duty, right, to maintain the pristine system, just religiously, civilly. The ideas that what had been shattered had to be reconstituted in its perfection. So this idea of salvaging what was still alive in the old system was a matter of spiritual identity for these individuals to some degree. The civil wars had, however, shattered, as we've seen, the state. Diocletian still thinks that if you cannot eliminate the consequences, the nefarious consequences of this problem, you can at least fix the causes of this. I mean, especially the conflict. I mean, we've seen it better in the video about the Tetrarchy, right? But the sense is that, of course, the system is not just about enforcing; it's also about an inner reason, right? That has to guide, just lucidly and divinely, the Romans under the guidance of their emperor as a divine medium. And as a consequence, everything has to rely on a certain degree of trust, of faith, as well. You cannot govern this enormous empire that is still intact, right, thanks to the Illyrian emperors. First of all, yes, without reinforcing central power, according to their view, at least given that they were feeling the periphery to become not just weak but even dangerous, right? Actually countering the same central authority, but to a sort of a detrimental end, right? Think about the Gallic Empire that had actually never had a secessionistic tendency, but wanted to sort of carve sort of a world on its own, right? Think about Palmyra, that instead it had been much more aggressive, but that was also sort of barely Roman if as whole. But the sense was that all the usurpers that had triggered civil wars, that had sort of continued to compromise the system, could be just rendered less, at least less likely to emerge, at least rendering their life more difficult, by essentially fragmenting peripheral authority. This was yet another leitmotif of the late Roman times. Think about the Roman fabrici that are, for the first time actually in Roman history, truly run by a centralized administration. They're brought away from the frontiers because they're too exposed to barbarians, to usurpers. They're brought in the Mediterranean core lands. And there is all, in fact, with Constantine, and again, things were already starting from this time, the concept that first the frontiers have to be protected, but better by local militias that, as we've seen, were essentially connected with the same idea. You have to remain in that place because it's your duty and you can't quite do what you want, with more mobile armies from the hinterland. So all a mechanism that, as you understand, was just falling into place because of broader dynamics even beyond the will of this or that emperor, right? Regarding this sort of weakening of peripheral authority, we can observe how, I don't know, the rhetor Menander doesn't actually like very much the provincial governor as such, nor he thinks that he's much of a great leader. The true imperial power stems from the center, from God, in a way that truly reinforces the need of a single ruler, single leader, after all, and a hierarchical system. Diocletian, in this sense, takes a definitive step, right? He doubled the number of provinces by, of course, breaking down the existing one into so-called frusta. Their governors become mainly civil functionaries, right? So they're stripped of their military functions that are attributed to local officials that, as we observed in the capitatio-iugatio, were sort of more connected with. They would be appointed also from other provinces and so on, just exactly to avoid at some point their connection, the stronger connection locally. But generally speaking, this is not what would end usurpation at Similia, as the end of the Tetrarchy proved dramatically. In any case, this is yet another administrative reform. You have these judices that rule this frusta, that there had been already some steps taken in this direction since the times of Gallienus, that are also in parallel to the issue of the mobile army, the vexillationes and this kind of stuff. Even Italy, this is very important symbolically, is split in vicaries. There is Annonarian Italy and Roman Italy, so-called. There are provinces as well established within the same territory. And you have different cities also that are rising to a greater status, used not as capitals, because Rome remains the only possible capital, and this was true throughout the entire Roman history, but that are, of course, politically and strategically more important as imperial residences, right? We're talking about Nicomedia for Diocletian, Milan for Maximianus or Coelius. So again, places where the emperors could move, say, gather important military forces, controlling important choke points. I mean, think about Nicomedia, just controlling the straits. In a sense, it's the same function eventually that Constantinople would have. Milan also controlling northern Italy, all the Alpine passes, say from Gaul to the Illyricum, from Italy to Germany, and so highly strategic relevance. The Augusti can control the work of the Caesares according to the Tetrarchic system. So, as you know, that also corresponded to a territorial pertinence of the same that had to be switched, etc. So, just to sort of intertwine a bit the destinies of this unitary empire, but just the Tetrarchic system per se is talking about a split of power that, for such a huge empire, still means essentially a localization of the same rulers' forces that doesn't inspire much unity. And in fact, Constantine will solve the problem by reconquering everything and maintaining that at least until Theodosius there wouldn't be any other split of the empire. So to reinforce, however, Diocletian's plan of a Roman unitary conscience, there is the confirmation of mandatory Latin across the empire. This is very relevant because, after all, we know that these times are the prodrome to, in fact, the so-called Byzantine era, also in the idea that the eastern part of the empire that mainly spoke Greek wouldn't, in spite maintaining, of course, Latin and a severe Latin influence in its political and especially military vocabulary, would sort of drift away in a much more Hellenizing direction. But that's how much Diocletian, that was not an Italic, was not a Latin strictly meant, thought of as a sort of homogenizing, gluing together necessity for the emperor. So he truly believed in part, as you understand here, a relatively incoherent system, this splitting of power just to avoid usurpations, rebellions, secessions, but at the same time needing to unite. Many historians also, as a philosophy of history and politics, stress that, of course, Diocletian's system was not really and fully coherent within itself. But you always want to appreciate the gigantic nature of these reforms that evidently were not just the act of sort of personal impressions or liking or, mere, volition. All right, so you want to appreciate that in part, as we were saying before, a great deal of these reforms was to actually live on, and that they had a future as such. What the subjects required Diocletian that he didn't have the historical, political, personal inclination to do was and especially the lower classes, was the fixation of and consolidation of juridical norms. In other words, a great legal reform would, after the 3rd century, sort of put together a more uniform, updated, clear legal code, which was not actually a Roman thing. Yet we often think of the Romans, and rightfully so, of course, for their legal culture and tradition, But the empire had been historically run by a sort of common law, right? Every community had its own autonomies, etc. So in this evident need, even from the side of the population, of having more certainty, more centralized power, because most commoners, even in spite of their troubles stemming from these reforms, were actually okay with the idea of a stronger man, of a sort of, again, we discussed populism in many ways, but of course making things like justice, right, making justice working fluidly, coherently, with certainty, was a huge deal, right? It wouldn't be until the 5th century under Theodosius II that, as you know, a perpetua sanctio was issued, right? That would be the base eventually for the St. Justinian Code. In Diocletian's times, what you really have, especially with the rescripta of 293-294, the Codex Gregorianus, right? This was used essentially to at least satisfy part of these needs. These were older collections that had fundamentally been used already by Roman lawyers to sort of fix some specific juridical authorities that, as you know, would be in fact salvaged and developed by even by Theodosius, Justinian, still today, right? In civil law, you have to study at least that. After the Codex Gregorianus, within the same time, you have the scripta of this second one, the Codex Hermogenianus, right? So there were books, codices, as the Latin says, stemming from private works, right? These were private lawyers had written this stuff down and collected it eventually, and edited it on the basis of practice, right? Of just the legal tribunals process, etc. And they already, right, by this time, these Gregorianus and these Hermogenianus show how let's say Diocletian's will had surely been behind the compaction of these books, right, and the necessity to build up some sort of juridical basis through this sheer will to power that could, say, help to regulate legally the entire empire, right? But at this time, say what would happen in Theodosian times was still distant from Roman mindset, just per se. Consider that, again, we tend to think in sort of late antique mode now, so already switching mood and light, looking at Diocletian, but we're just at the end of the 3rd century, so the old Rome is still pretty much alive in many ways, and so just the Roman ethos regarding the necessity of a perpetua sanctio, like in the Byzantine mentality at that point of Theodosius II, was yet to come and to be especially possibly imposed just even on the West, as it wouldn't happen, in fact, properly in later times. But we will see it better in another video. In any case, I made multiple juridical history videos to explain you how this practically works. It's a huge topic, and I had the pleasure at least to study it a bit back in the day. The 3rd century civil wars had and barbarian invasions had brought to a reconsideration of what imperial authority had to be about. I cannot digress exactly on the deeper meanings, say, of now we will partly mention Christianity, etc., but the sense is, of course, that the imperial authority had always been military and religious in nature. The 3rd century had witnessed this rise and fall of soldier emperors, very often taken out by their own same troops through intrigues and sort of this, in fact, soldiery caprice based on sometimes very venial sort of reasons. So Diocletian was convinced, albeit being part of the same sort of background in a general sense, that only a mystical halo could essentially prevent the breaking out of civil wars and, generally speaking, the competition for the purple. Right? Hence the great Tetrarchic machination that we have already seen. But there is something more, because from one side, yes, the idea was the restoration of moral, spiritual, religious standards. At the same time, the Saint Diocletian expressed an idea of authority that was much more authoritarian compared to the spontaneous one that, say, Augustus was just historically symbolizing. Right? In Augustan times, you would have never had anyone kneeling in front of Augustus, at least in Rome, because it would, just for the Italian citizenry, that would have been, wouldn't made any sense, right? Romans were the chosen people of God because they were free, and so just they would recognize as freemen a primus inter pares as the princeps. Yes, de facto Augustus was a monarch, and say the Roman world had was distant from the egalitarian tribal warrior ones. Equally, in the 3rd century, you had yet another step, however, that has increased towards the sort of sclerotization that we observe also in the Byzantine system, in the immobility, etc. And so in the celebration of almost a iconic ruler. There was, from Diocletian's side, especially the insistence on the consuetudo venerationis, that was, by that point, in Roman imperial history, a truly familiar monarchic tradition. In other words, accomplished the aforementioned social stratification, the oligarchization of the system. The mere imperial figure had entailed a sort of divine, semi-divine status, at least, that was, yes, in line with tradition, meaning that, of course, rulers were meant, in virtue of their function, to have, as we've seen, those qualities that would place them closer to the divinity and acting as a medium of the same grace, the same victory, the Imperium, the Holy Ghost, etc. But just like it had happened in Greece back in the day, for which, certain herons were erected to, officials that had nothing done except dying, in Roman times, to the imperatores sacratissimis, sacri vultus, by the way, was owed that adoratio, or in Greek proskunesis, right? The latter immediately connecting the Alexandrine Eastern practice, right, of kneeling, in fact, in front of the ruler, that had been in fact brought by the Magus introduced by the Magus into the Western world back in fact Hellenistic times. This was something, again, Augustus would have been shocked by someone kneeling in front of him, a Roman kneeling in front of him at least. In the 3rd century, this instead had become sort of, a normal thing after all, for different reasons. Today we do not have the time to just explain, but again, the sense of simply accepting somebody was greater than the others, but without necessarily look at, again, how short-lived all the most of the Illyrian 3rd century crisis emperors had been, running parallel to the increase of these sort of acts of, again, of imposition, and you understand essentially how the same faith in the empire had been declining, and so the will to fight, to work, and all these issues that were following. In the Roman Empire, this practice had been in part mitigated. It had been configured, for example, as the adoratio of the imperial clemencia, so not necessarily some say, the emperor as a whole, but of course certain spiritual characteristics of the same. Again, we'll see this in some greater detail in another video. In any case, Diocletian was okay with that, right? The idea of being considered as a giant, as someone that was just above the rest of the people. And so you can easily see in Roman art how this idea was changing, how colossal statues were being erected, the eyes were sort of increasing in size, the proportions, the perspective were just fixed in a more hieratic fashion, with the loss in importance of the commoners, etc. Diocletian contemporated, by the way, the adoptive principle with the marriages of his daughter with the Caesar Galerius Maximianus, and of Maximinian Herculius' stepdaughter to the Caesar Constantius Chlorus, that for this reason had to abandon Helena, that, as you know, was already Constantine's mother, and this matrimonial policy was designed, as we've seen within the Tetrarchy, to reinforce the connection with the proper boss, right? So in this sort of divine sense, broadly speaking, so just think about Constantine's sort of milieu, aside from this dynastic game and lack of recognition. Say this is a natural son that had just formed, shaped his view of power, etc. How much this affected the same Byzantine culture in an ideal sense since the beginning, right? These were very different worlds. It's difficult to simply... it would be very interesting to analyze, for example, how much the Maesian Illyrian background had sort of played within those scarcely Romanized populations of the Balkan hinterland. Would say that sense of imperium, of militaristic theological mindset, and what kind of men were these people? They weren't typical, I don't know, you'd say Western emperors in a sense. Say 100 years before, you had still the Antonites, where you just consider what this means and what big of a change it had been. Then there is Christianity, of course, which is a huge issue. We haven't really talked enough about the late Roman Empire. Sometimes I complain because I make much more late Roman than early Imperial videos, right? But of course, there is so much just in influence later history, culture, etc. And the problem of Christianity is key. Say I observed just in my work, also in Schwerpunkt, in front of the masses, etc. The difficulty that people still have fundamentally in understanding the affirmation of Christianity, right? This strange sort of conspiracy, catastrophistic theories, but properly lacking the theological fundamentals to understand what was happening within the Imperial Catholic tradition for Christianity to affirm itself over what we call paganism. And I have never heard so far an actual explanation that makes sense, just the most common narratives, either just pro or against paganism or Christianity, depending on the situation. They're just mostly nationalistic and or socialistic fourth estate or superstition of the 19th and 20th century. They have absolutely nothing to do with what the spiritual, metaphysical, and broader, say, universal reality of late antiquity really were. In any case, Diocletian's relation with Christianity is quite complex. Of course, he persecuted Christians, but it's not that simple. As he was, of course, reigning, he realized that the salvation of the old world in its old content was opposed to this great spiritual phenomenon that Christianity had incarnated. Diocletian's, say, political talent as a statesman especially was definitely indicating him that by that point already a clash against Christianity was useless, right? Many people I see, there are channels that basically get only, say, hundreds of thousands of subscribers, millions of views, just because they say, the paganism could be repristinated until 475 AD, because look, there was this guy who was kind of, they prevented, this is the probably lowest level of, I don't know even how to qualify this. I mean, let's leave aside, of course, that there are people who, of course, talk this about still Julian's times. Of course, there are interesting takes on that, and it's not merely a map, but just how superficial, shallow, simplistic, and completely uncultured most people's need to find satisfaction in this kind of answers is appalling, to say the least. Looking at Diocletian, of course the picture is complex. I should make a video just on this specific ruler and his relation with Christianity, but let's say that in 296 Diocletian had persecuted Manichaeism. That of course was just like we were talking about Bogomilism yesterday, Catharism, etc. This was a dualistic Gnostic heresy. Basically, the composite, the complete opposite to the Imperial Catholic tradition, both paganly and Christianly. And Diocletian, of course, had defined it as persica adversaria nobis gente, actually a persica, like with the ablative locative complement. That is to say, the religion had stemmed from the very devil's hand, basically, from our enemy, from our foes, right? The Persian people, right? Which seems to be quite sort of pertinent still to this day, but if anything, because Manichaeism had in Persia quite an interesting history. We'll see this too. Again, I'm sorry I don't have time, I always tell you this, but you understand this video is also pretty long by itself. And Manichaeism had dramatically spread among the masses, right? Part of the problem, of course, of these essentially populistic, degenerate, fourth estate, lessers people, self-sabotaging superstition was the worst you could use in a time in which you were trying essentially to, of course, going in the completely opposite direction, of course, one of strengthening of moral superiority of the individual, right? And of course, profound value of free will and will to power against predetermined materialistic relativism, etc. And of course, it offended Roman tradition, all right? And it was absolutely positive to persecute. Manichaeism was a form of religious opposition that had already manifested itself politically and militarily within the Roman Empire, because the recent Egyptian revolt that had been crushed by Diocletian had his government had already, say, witnessed what this could be about, right? The usual masses had tried to use any kind of excuse to sneak away from responsibility and to self-sabotage the system. Christianity was a completely different thing, really another kettle of fish. And of course it did contain some, say, of course any of these movements could be both, say, interpreted in both ways to some extent. We don't have time, in fact, to digress even on Manichaeism and some, say, theologically relevant aspects of the same. But Christianity, of course, in its Catholic synoptic dimension at this point, just essentially a few decades before the Nicene Creed was affirmed in a fully doctrinal, orthodox sense, was actually supportive of the same imperial authority. Right at this point, of course, Christians were not, were still the underdogs, and of course they were going against a specific practice of imperial cultural recognition, which was the reason why the only reason why fundamentally they had been persecuted historically, but they were not hostile to the empire as such. I mean, it was the empire just fits an earthly dimension that should not be considered as long as in fact it's not divine in standard with heaven, right? And so eventually we made videos about how Christianity, once was legalized in the empire, elaborated an adequate political an adequate policy, right, of support towards, in fact, lay authority. And I mean, how many videos I made about the Renovatio Imperii, about the relation, say, between the empire and the papacy, etc. That's all actually a fully coherent picture. At this point already, Christianity was already the most common religion in the empire, and almost triumphant in its eastern part, right? So Diocletian was likely not attempting to even go against it initially. It would have been too costly, right? So he decided himself, for reasons we will explain now, only in the later times of his government, 303. And those who had pushed him to essentially start persecutions were those men of letters around him that thought that it could still be attempted to sort of curb this new phenomenon. I will not digress either on the spread of Christianity and the actual meaning that it had at this point, why it had come up, etc. But it's evident that the sort of intelligentsia was pressuring Diocletian to act. Porphyrius' writing against the Christians was the sort of manifesto for which, for example, Hierocles recalled himself to it and proceeded in their own writings, adding other motives to write the same. Caesar Galerius Maximianus was a staunch anti-Christian, but as it was just foreseeable, as perhaps the same Diocletian believed, his 4 edicts against the Christians, from the first in February 303 to the 4th in the first days of 304, failed. Right? This is meaningful, especially if you consider that Diocletian's persecution was against Christianity was the most radical one ever in Roman history, so much so that it was even more vast, right, than as much as the religion persecuted at that point. This was so bitter as tenacious the actual love of the great emperor for the classical tradition that he was defending in a way, and that he saw threatening in Christianity. Many were the traditores, that if you know what it means in early Christian history, has to do with those who in fact literally gave the scriptures, right, because in Latin the traditores are those who literally transferred this good, right, to someone else, for these books to be destroyed. Among those, you have the same Pope, Marcellinus, the Bishop of Rome. But aside from the fact that these persecutions were sort of ad hoc, they were carried out especially in areas where the Christians were concentrated, but the provinces had some degree of discretion, as we were saying before. It wasn't like an homogeneous or just possibly, successful possibility, right, of application, especially to eradicate Christianity. And so the actual resistance strength of the Christian community overall remained intact, right? And among the martyrs of Diocletian's persecution, you find Lucian of Antioch, whose Christological doctrine is quite fascinating, because it would have actually created lots of problems for the same Christianity later on, right? In fact, according to this author, Christ would have not had a human soul, because his soul would have been the same Logos incarnated, which is a heresy, because this is not about, you see how much dualism, how much the same Gnosticism, Manichaeism had actually influenced this early theories. It's a sort of mental disease, basically, and Christianity had nothing to do with that, of course. But unfortunately, especially for the eastern regions of the empire, fortunately mostly for the Byzantines, there would have been countless dogmatic controversies, right, concerning this within, again, the Christian episcopate. In fact, Antioch's school was one of the most famous regarding also these problems, like the Syrians would always be sort of met. Paradoxically, was the more gradually and less Christianized West that would be more truly Catholic doctrinally, compared to the equilibristic attempts by Constantinople to mitigate these turmoils in the East due to these obscene heresies. But aside from this, this sort of serious consequences because of the later schismatic developments, this instance of this problem of the traditores especially would be quite felt, right, in Christian history, especially in the African churches at this point. In 311, many Christian communities of Numidia will refuse to recognize the Bishop of Carthage, Sicilian, because he had been consecrated by traditor bishop, right? And this was, of course, a problem, meaning that this was just an excuse, right? It was a movement of the Circoncilionists that supported Donatism, and Oraclist essentially was weaponized by it. This heresy that insists on the purity of the clergy and not on the actual contrition of the individual, right? That is still sanctioned, in fact, in the Catholic Church. The idea that even if the priest is unfit, right, the sacraments are still valid as long as you actually are spiritually aware, right, of your sins, and you're truly convinced of what you're doing in front of God, right? And this actual Circuncilian rebellion was just the usual problem of the province. There was more rebellious. These armed groups wanted to go around just to steal the bishop's wealth. This is the usual Gnostic BS that happened with Catholicism, later on with Bogomilism. It's always the same story. It's just an excuse of leftistic, hypocritical, moralistic fanatism, just to destroy all what the Imperial Catholic tradition has established for, people's to the people's benefits. And in fact, that again, it's the fringe that does this, while here Carthage was, there were problems actually all around, but the idea that still the Carthaginian, the African church worked properly, and that somebody would complain just because the guy, the bishop, was initially not consecrated by another bishop that at once had just been a traditor, etc. Would have emphasiated the entire validity of this guy's work. It's of course completely ridiculous, to say the least. And the same, say, Christian authorities at some point had, of course, in order to avoid bloodshed, the other province said, okay, we'll just obey the Roman authorities, but keep your cult going and don't worry about that more than much, right? And so there is all a martyrological issue here, but let's say the concept of the sacrament is not really that subjective in the measure in which it's administrated, and so the way it is received, just for these intransigent, formalistic, really relativistic and subjectivistic standards. The Catholic clergy always remained against this sort of puritanic hypocrisy that was leading nowhere and doing no good for anyone, also because it was just an excuse, right, for making a mess, stealing, killing, and so on, right? But unfortunately, it would go on, it would be a problem going on throughout the entire late antiquity, right, and would re-emerge at the end of the Middle Ages, also with, let's not digress on that. The Donatists would simply go on with their own sort of strange tensions, just like the Agonistici. They would inebriate themselves with the anxiety of martyrdom while keeping to addressing the Catholics with their title of traditores, right? Betrayers, even though they had simply, just trying to compromise with authorities during persecution, saving lives and coming back, repented of what they had done, and just, accepted that, of course, this had not, compromised the purity of the clergy. It could be also, and especially one of the sacraments administered by these sort of betraying priests. But again, among the traditores and the defensors faith in the course of the 3rd century, you have this the same terminology, traditor, which in spoken language, finally in the Neo-Latin ones, would become sort of the negative, sort of from translator to betray, right? So, and so in the 3rd century you already have that, like together with other linguistical notes that for which today, for example, you notice I use the ecclesiastical pronunciation because we think that it's around this time that things change regarding the harshness of the original Latin. On November the 20th, 303, the Bicentennial of Diocletian recurred. This was a celebration which basically happened every once in a while, depending 5, 10, 20 years, etc., in which essentially the empire prayed for the emperor, essentially took a vow for his health, etc. The same Diocletian participated in this, meaning that he was the true medium with the divinity, so whatever the people did, also he transferred to God himself. And as such, by the way, he celebrated them in Rome, right? Rome was always the only exclusive center of the empire. It doesn't matter whether it was a peripheral city compared to Constantinople at some point, St. Justinian. So Rome, for a Roman Empire, is exclusively the only city existing. All the rest of the empire is the same city of Rome, right? So the centrality of Rome symbolically, ideologically, theologically, metaphysically, spiritually, religiously, is always there. Right? Rome will remain by far the single most important city in the West, culturally speaking, throughout the following centuries and beyond. So we tend to neglect this. We tend to, if you go to Roman museums, you find National Museum, the famous maquette made by, I don't remember who's the name of the author, but it's about the peak of the urbanistic peak of Rome. And it's of course depicted in Constantinian times, where all you can recognize everything, including the famous arc, etc. And Rome was, in many ways, sort of a sleeping beauty there, in the midst of all these problems going on, and of course, quite of a splendid living symbol of the same empires by the issue. Now, in this Vicennalia, Diocletian was old for the time. I mean, he was 60, and he met there with Maximinian Herculius. In that meeting, surely lots of interesting things were discussed that we do not know. We realized that the empire had sort of gone ahead, that Diocletian had maintained power. After all, this means the imperial authority was maintained for his time. It was a shared guidance, of course. And Diocletian, however, thought that, given his age, it was important to withdraw, right? Not completely, and also with some concerns, right? For, of course, he would maintain control to a degree, or at least what he would watch over what would happen, famously enough, in his split palace. That is more like a casa fortress, right, than an average palace. And so this would be a test for the Tetrarchic system. Diocletian and Maximinian Herculius would have had to step down, and leaving as Augusti, the two Caesars. They would have become Augusts themselves, and they would name in turn other Caesars, right? So it's sort of the supreme test of the Tetrarchic system functionment. Maximinian Herculius was different from Diocletian. Right, was more of a practical individual. He was not as ideological, and as such, he thought that power was not to sacrifice, especially after such a harshly fought sort of government. We will talk about him as well at some point. He was a soldier, right, and these leaders, as we've seen, were not historical to back down. I mean, Diocletian had sort of brought an end to that phase, but there was still some sort of bitterness regarding this decision. There is a comparison with Sulla. Caesar was told to have commented on Sulla's deposition of his dictatorship. Sullam nescisse litteras qui dictaturam deposuerit, which was a way of saying, basically, Sulla was illiterate to leave, dictatorship, which was seen in Caesarian times. Many of it about the Fortuna Kaiser is explaining abundantly that sense of divine power being given at the head of a chosen people, right, with even possibility of doing more. Caesar would be doing something very different, and so one can think of that comparison with Sulla as well. Herculius stepped down. He to his Jovian colleague in the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. So Diocletian's god, he swore that, and so God just per se, but let's skip this topic because, again, I will start digressing on my usual they were the same religion. They were actually the same religion. It's just the approach to it that changed. And the divine, in fact, self-salvation would change. That's the only difference, really, between Christianity and paganism. But if one says that, people usually do not believe that. But Herculius, in this see, swore that he would have granted, he would have actually agreed with the abdication. In April of 305, he celebrated his own bicennalia. On May the 1st, both Augusti, abdicated. Diocletian again retreated himself in Split, Aspalathos, in what would have been this most famous fortress villa that, if you visit Split in Croatia, you can still basically see. It's basically the city itself, at least the old town, and it still follows the perimeter, right, of the fortress. There is still, technically the palace as such, but of course during the Middle Ages it was all sort of further changed. And I made a video about Split, by the way. Medieval Split, you can check that out if you're interested. So Sulla's model there, imagine Diocletian just on the Adriatic, watching from the windows of his beautiful palace, thinking of this classical memoirs of this great example that's so famous, as a great renunciation. It's almost Pilatus-like, Maximianus Herculius remained close to Rome, closer at least, in a villa of his between Lucania and Campania. We do not know where exactly, perhaps near Salerno. And perhaps this is what some important scholars said, that maybe someone had told him that Sulla himself, 300 years before, but more, had stopped right after the abdication in a villa in Campania, not far away from Rome, to watch over again, right? And surely the same Maximian wanted to watch over the situation, right? Surveilling the smooth transition of the Tetrarchy, of the Augustan diarchy to the Caesarian one, and the election to another Caesarian diet. And this would have, of course, had major implications, because as the beautiful statue of the Tetrarchs that the Venetians brought back from Constantinople in 1204, that you can still admire, in fact, in Venice, you can immediately see the very dark sort of conspiratorial mood that these couple of guys whispering in each other's ears, really, as we can imagine, these voices running, I don't know, in Diocletian's palace or wherever, during these meetings for the partitioning of the globe, right, of the global empire, were much more serious issues than anything we can, say, imagine having happened, say, around the same times, and handling an order that, as we know, would have, after all, been maintained towards a more unitary direction. Of course, the empire would have been partitioned again at different times, but what Diocletian was founding in many ways was paving the way to the same Constantinian formula, right? As far as we've seen at the beginning, there is some of it. There is definitely a contribution, aside from the different wishes of Diocletian, to some sort of compaction, actually, of power, but thanks to, in fact, his own administrative reforms and the idea that there had been sort of different type of state, different type of order, calibrated from that higher ground, and that is definitely something to be witnessed starting from Diocletian's times to a very important extent. Right. So Diocletian's history, I'm glad I've made this video because again I made one a long time ago and I'm not so sure, I made anything else to explain better, anything along the way. Again, this cycle is a bit crazy. I happen to talk at years of distance of topics of this huge relevance just because it's how they come out from the lottery here. But I think we, as I always say, we did talk about something else in its stead, and I'm glad at least that there are some topics that are being sort of repeated, others just coming by, accumulating, sticking together, like providing with this greater glue that keeps the channel together continuistically, right, and hopefully to your liking. So only one video on Diocletian. Well, actually, there is the one about the Tetrarchy. Yeah, basically made. Well, it doesn't even talk about him that much. It's rather what happened later also, but that's the point. And I will be hopefully making similarly themed videos soon. Recently, there's been a bit of Byzantine stuff, so I'm glad I managed to connect sort of randomly again these topics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.